And welcome back from lunch. My name is Krista. I am a 32-year-old white female with dark blonde wavy hair and bangs, and I am currently wearing a white collared shirt. I am an accessibility advisor at the University of Toronto, working with the engineering departments. And to welcome us back, I'm going to start with an access check. So we understand access to be a shared responsibility between everyone in this space. We will strive to create an accessible space that reduces the need for you to disclose a disability for the purpose of gaining an accommodation. In doing this together, we strive to welcome disability and the changes it brings into our space. So is there anything about the virtual space that we should address now? Are there any other access needs that might affect your participation in the conference that we could also address? If any access needs arise, please connect with Annika Stabenow over Zoom or email at as.learning@utoronto.ca. Okay. Now I have the privilege to introduce our next guest. And our next moderator, who is Dr. Pignatello. He is the Associate Dean in the Office of Learner Affairs in the Temerity Faculty of Medicine. He is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, Associate Professor with the Department of Psychiatry, University of Toronto, and the Medical Director of the Provincial Pediatric Telemental Health Services at the Hospital for Sick Children. He has worked in many academic and community-based settings, and has won awards for his teaching, mentorship, and work in virtual mental health care. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pignatello.
Great, thanks very much, Krista. So just to set the stage for myself, firstly, I'm going to apologize for the noise in the background. There's some work going on around me that I can't control, and so hopefully it won't cause too much disruption. I'll keep my microphone on mute as much as I can. But moving on to the panel, just about myself, I am, what I do, but I'm in my 60s. I have short gray hair, and so it's actually more white than gray now anymore. Wearing glasses and a collared gray polo shirt. I'm going to start by introducing the panelists. And then we will move on to some questions and discussions that I will lead. So in no particular order, I'm happy to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Elsa Asensio, who is a lawyer with the employment law team at the CLCYR. She was previously with the Mobile Legal and Social Justice Initiative based out of Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, Niagara Community Legal Clinic in Brant, Haldeman, Norfolk, and Huron-Perth Community Legal Clinic. Her practice focuses on matters related to the Employment Standards Act, Occupational Health and Safety Act, Ontario Human Rights Code, and precarious work. When not fighting for justice, she's likely painting, watching The Witcher, Marvel, and Star Wars films, and hanging out with her family and two cats, Penelope and Lily. So welcome, Elsa.
Thank you.
And next, I would introduce Odelia Bay, who's also a lawyer, an academic and advocate who identifies as episodically disabled. Odelia is working towards her PhD at Osgoode Hall Law School. Her doctoral research examines how workers with episodic disabilities balance the competing needs of self-care and work. Odelia holds an LLM from Columbia Law School, a JD from University of Ottawa, and a journalism degree from Toronto Metropolitan University. She's also a co-founder of the Canadian Association of Lawyers with Disabilities. Prior to studying law, Odelia worked as a broadcast journalist. Say hello, Odelia.
Hello.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to Ali Imri, who is an immigration and refugee lawyer at Landings LLP. Before joining Landings, she clerked at the Ontario Court of Appeal and graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School as the gold medalist of her class. While at Osgoode, she co-founded and ran the Disability Collective of Osgoode, a student group run for and by students with disabilities to provide a platform for peer support and collective advocacy. Ali is passionate about accessibility in legal education and in the legal profession. Natalie? Okay. And our fourth panelist is Asma. Asma is a dedicated community advocate, child and youth educator, and founding member of Sai Somali, an education-based organization empowering Somali youth in the Greater Toronto Area. She's currently pursuing a Master's of Public Health and Nutrition and Dietetics at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, UofT. Her research interests focus on the intersection of food access and security with Indigenous and Black food sovereignties, public health policy, and school food programs. As a member of the Accessibility Committee this year, Asma actively advocated for addressing gaps and representing student voices, ensuring inclusivity and accessibility within and beyond her UofT community. Asma?
Is actually not able to make it today, so we'll continue with the three panelists.
Okay, thank you. Again, apologies for the noise behind me. I will try to speak up. So we're going to start off the panel discussion by asking each panelist to start off with one or two take-home points that you hope the group will be able to take home after the panel discussion. So let's start with Cordelia.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, it was a bit of a challenge to think of what my gems would be before I even started talking today. But there are a few things I think in this context that are really important. I love the access check that was done at the beginning of this session, and that's a big part of what one of my takeaways would be, which is shifting away from accommodation model to an accessibility and inclusion model. And for me, that means always working to try and identify and reduce barriers collectively and not placing it on the individual student, and that it's a continuous journey. So, you know, we have to be prepared to improve and then make change and improve again. It's never ending. There's never going to be a complete checklist, and we have to be able to be okay with that and figuring out when we're wrong and moving forward. The other thing that I speak to often as somebody with an episodic disability is that many folks with disabilities never come forward, either because of the stigma attached to disability and disablement, or because they don't identify as disabled. I also teach as a graduate student, and I have many students who come forward to me and say, oh, well, I just, I don't need accommodation. I had a head injury, and I'm working through it, but it's not a disability, right? Or I'm dealing with a long-term cancer diagnosis, but it's not something that needs to be accommodated. I'm just having a hard time. So students, it kind of speaks also to the first point, which is why the accessibility and inclusion point is so important.
Thank you. Elsa, what are you going to hope that we're going to take away from the discussion today?
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. And I noticed that my description didn't clarify where I work. It said the acronym. I work at the Community Legal Clinic of York Region. So if anyone needs to find me, I'm right there. So what I was hoping as a takeaway, as going over the materials and the questions, one thing I really want folks, and echoing what Odelia mentioned, shifting the narrative from the individual to a community. And I say that because part of, and if anyone has taken ARAO training, we talk about the anti-oppression charts. What are the isms at play that are currently in society, and how can we offset that? How can we respond to that? And usually the answer is as a collective, right? Coming together, because for all intents and purposes, everything is framed as the individual. And even that, I speak as someone who practices employment law, and specifically I help workers in precarious situations. A lot of it is still focused on the individual. What have they done to seek out accommodations? So hopefully the takeaway is shifting from that right? While finding that balance that the laws may not be there yet, but I do think there's that harmony that we could find in these discussions.
Thank you. Allie?
I think for me, one of the takeaways, just in thinking through answers to the questions as well, is again, kind of shifting perspectives, but for me, that comes to trusting students to be the experts in their bodies, in their disabilities, and in their needs. I think the system is really set up to devalue the personal knowledge that people with disabilities have and to put authority in the hands of medical professionals, of accommodation officers, of all of that. And I think that really does students, employees a disservice. And I think so much seems to be framed around the risks of accommodation or preventing unfair use of accommodation or these kind of like fear-based perspectives. And I think that's just a fundamentally flawed way of looking at accommodation and of accommodating people. And I think returning agency to people to talk about themselves, to talk about what they need, to talk about their experiences is really important in figuring out how to move forward in creating more accessible professional education.
Thank you again. I'm going to move on to the next point. It was already touched on briefly. It was alluded to that the people, learners, tend to avoid reaching out for help with accommodations, hope that they don't exist or hope that they'll go away. So what would you say, how could we encourage learners to reach out for assistance regarding accommodations? And Allie, why don't we start with you on that one?
Sure, I have a few thoughts. I think first of all, a lot of people don't know what accommodations are available. And so don't know that there's certain things they can be asking for that would be helpful. I think even sometimes that's intentional. I think in my undergrad, it was very intentional that you weren't supposed to know what accommodations were available, and you would just kind of state your needs and other people would decide what you needed in terms of accommodations. But I think that model, again, really doesn't lead to people using accessibility services, because if you don't know something's there, you may not be able to ask for it. And so I think being really upfront about what kinds of things that accommodations are available for, what those accommodations look like, is really important. Like even for me, kind of a brief example, like I have a chronic illness that's severely fatiguing. And in undergrad, I didn't know that it was an option to ask for my exams to be spaced out so that I could rest for a day in between, as opposed to kind of having them all back to back and then feeling really awful for weeks afterwards. And so when you make information like that transparent, I think it really changes how people access accommodations.
I can't stress that enough.
Adelia?
That is so spot on.
Also, then maybe also, why don't you keep going? But how about, what else would you add to that?
No, Ali took everything what I wanted to say, but more so, that was basically my experience in law school, where I needed an accommodation, and it was a bit of a, what do you ask for? And usually the shield of confidentiality is used to prevent folks from knowing what options are there. So you would ask like, oh, what other options are there? It's confidential. I can't say anything. And so I think, and appreciating that you have the autonomy as well to ensure that your privacy is protected, and like education officials aren't necessarily telling, hey, that person has this accommodation. But it does play a bit of a catch-22 in where folks they know they need more, they know there could be creative, but they don't know how they could push those boundaries in the institution. And I think it just comes down to believing the student, believing the learner at the core. They know themselves best. I think, I'm trying to remember, but back when I was in law school, part of my severe anxiety, I just needed a bottle of lavender that just snapped me out of it, if that makes sense. And it may have not made sense to the faculty, and luckily they let me bring it in, but that was a good example of the trusting what I need, right? And not necessarily what's in the pre-developed options out there.
Yeah. I mean, what Elsa just said in terms of those pre-developed options, I also found to be an extreme barrier. And I think I can maybe address some of that. But, as Ali spoke to, the education is really important so people know what's out there. There's the challenge of the material. Of course, it's supposed to be challenging. But then for students with disabilities, there's also the challenge of trying to get through the program. And letting folks know that part of it can be dealt with, that there is help for that is really important. And that education is twofold. It's, for the students themselves, the people that, you're trying to reach out to, but also generally. If there's an opportunity actually to come back to Ali, because, it's mentioned in her bio, the work that she did at Osgood, in terms of the Disability Collective, they did some great campaigns around destigmatizing the accommodations and accessibility for law students, which was not something that was around when I went to law school. It was deeply stigmatizing. There was a lot of suspicion about whether or not folks who had accommodations were faking it, were just attempting to try and get, extra time. And so all of that stuff was very discouraging. And then the barriers that were part of the process were also very difficult. So, I have multiple sclerosis. The person who was my accessibility advisor at the time at the school let me know that they were very well aware of what MS was about because their brother was a neurologist and that they knew it was episodic. So I had to go and get a new doctor's note from my neurologist every semester, which is difficult and expensive and, time consuming. I know people who are incredibly capable folks who are doing amazing advocacy work for others. And yet, when being told you have to go to your doctor again and again and again, they actually opt not to do it. So it's like mind blowing in some ways that there are people who are so capable of helping other people, but the process is so difficult, onerous, and also shaming that they just decide not to do it for themselves.
I agree. I think the stigma is another reason people really don't seek accommodations. I think almost everyone I talked to in law school who had a disability, had accommodations, had some experience of feeling judged or feeling like they had to keep that a secret in case other people found out. I know for me in my first year, because of my illness, I had to take a reduced course load. And I had heard from some friends that someone was going around in my section saying, well, it's not fair that we're being graded against Ali because she has way more time to study than the rest of us. Meanwhile, I'm spending 6 to 8 hours a day in bed, certainly not studying. And so I think when those kinds of things become known, there was really no way for me to hide that I was doing school part-time because I just wasn't in half of their classes. But I think that is something that is really discouraging for people because it can be really challenging in an environment like a professional program.
We're moving into thoughts and discussions around stigma, which is obviously an important issue and certainly going to be a potential barrier for learners, but also for programs and approach to that. Maybe also anything you would like to add to stigma? How is it demonstrated and how can that be addressed? Then I'm going to also ask Ali and Adelia to speak a little bit more to how stigma can be addressed.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
I just got a signal that my internet was unstable. So in terms of stigma, and I think I'm going to go back to what my opening statement was, which was the focus of my theme will be shifting from the individual to the community. And so I find usually folks, they are aware of the stigma, right? The person who is seeking accommodation is aware of the systemic issues at play, right? But in my day-to-day work, oftentimes my focus is with employers, but I find a good portion of my call is explaining to them just accommodation 101, disability 101, and frankly, human rights 101, right? Because I get a lot of clients who face other forms of systemic oppression. And usually my job is to come in and explain to them this is, for example, historically speaking, why we have the Human Rights Code because of X, Y, Z reason, right? And usually once I empower folks with that knowledge, they're able to go, oh, I didn't know. Okay, yeah, let's kind of go from there. And that's usually the best case scenarios, right? And of course, we'll have the worst case scenarios. But in terms of breaking down that stigma, it is actively getting those who hold power. So in the case of faculty, in the case of institutions, actively knowing the systems at play, right? Knowing that even ourselves within these institutions, what can we do, right? So for example, like the ones who get it, they do training for their whole staff of what is a disability, and it isn't like focus on you have this. No, it's the reality is society at some arbitrary reason decided, okay, this is the way things should be. And for some reason, anyone who doesn't fit that arbitrary framework is deemed disabled, different, and all these terms that are meant to really bring us down, when in reality it's, well, wait, let's have a broader conversation on why these frameworks exist. Who developed these frameworks, why are these frameworks there, et cetera, et cetera. I say that from a high level, like theoretical basis, but all to say, once we got that conversation going, I found in my practice for levels for stigma and the barriers to break down. Now, of course, it's not perfect. And the reality is I've found myself usually giving lectures and mini lessons when, to be honest, I shouldn't be in that position. I'm the one advocating for myself, and I shouldn't be also teaching them because, part of me wants to be like, I need the invoice. But I find that for us to get meaningful change, that needs to be addressed. Actively learn what is a disability and understand that it's just, for some reason, society has set up an arbitrary framework of this is what normal is, and therefore anything outside of that is not normal. It is arbitrary, it is random, and it has nothing to do with the individual. Once we get there, I think slowly things will be progressing.
Amelia?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. And the note I made here is we need cultural shifts in how we regard disability, but we also need pedagogical shifts in how we're teaching. So again, because doing graduate work, I get to have some experience teaching students. I remember having a discussion in a class about disability broadly related to the subject matter, but accommodations for peers came up. And somebody said, how is it fair that my colleagues get to have more time on the exam? And I put the question back to the class. Is it perhaps that the way we're teaching is extremely unfair to begin with? And within a law school environment, we're talking about examinations that are 100% and a semester's worth of material within 2 hours. It's incredibly demanding and stressful, and not necessarily a good measure of how much information students have retained, and it's an unfair system. And so maybe that's where, again, looking to access and inclusion to guide us. The system is what's unfair, not the accommodation. And another experience that I had that's relevant to that is I've had the opportunity to study as a law student both in Canada and the United States, where they've had the Americans with Disabilities Act for a long time. And it was like night and day going there for two reasons. One, the system for accommodations was just much easier to access, although with MS, I certainly acknowledge that I had a diagnosis privilege, especially in the context of the United States, because I didn't have to get documentation anymore. I had the diagnosis and I was set. But I found that the options for me in terms of accommodation were much broader. The folks who were working there were far more informed about what the options were in a holistic way. You know, they talked about actually the importance of learning outside the classroom and accommodations that followed me outside of the classroom, which was pretty amazing. But also, we didn't have the same restrictions at the law school there in terms of hard deadlines. Students were welcome to approach their instructors for, not even for an accommodation for disability, just to say, I need some more time on this. Is this possible? Yes. So I didn't have to disclose or seek an accommodation. The exams were structured in such a way that I didn't need an accommodation for my particular disability. I had more time. I could choose the environment in which I was writing. And so those barriers didn't even exist. So it was a freeing environment. I felt much less stigma there.
It certainly sounds like if the environment is already set up to be set up for success for people with accommodations, then that relieves a tremendous sense of onus and burden on the individual needing that. Mm-hmm. So let's look a little bit at some thoughts and tips on overcoming challenges and barriers that you may face with the process itself. For example, challenges and barriers around assessment and implementation of accommodations. Maybe we'll start with Elsa.
I've had I don't want to say privilege, it wasn't a privilege, but I've definitely had the experience of kind of two comparative workplaces, one a healthy one and one not healthy one. And I could tell you the main difference was the one where it was more healthy, had more follow-ups, and I felt like I was in the steering wheel, right? I was able to put forward what I wanted. And of course, we know under the Human Rights Code, and for those who don't know, they're looking for reasonable accommodation. They're not looking for perfect accommodation. So that's usually the difficult conversation I have with my clients is we're not looking for perfect, we're looking for reasonable. And to be honest, reasonable for the law may not be what you need. And that's just the blunt reality. But in the cases of the healthy workplaces I've been where, for example, I'll just be transparent now. I'm in an accommodation right now. And it's very much, we believe you. What do you need? Okay, we'll work with that. We're all in this as a team, not as an inconvenience. And monthly, bi-weekly follow-ups as needed, depending on, the circumstances. Whereas when I was in an unhealthy workplace relationship, it was no follow-up. We're all kind of suffering. We're all miserable. And then an explosion of burnout happens, right? That I would say don't do that. Because ultimately, it leaves the person feeling demotivated, not motivated, defeated. And frankly, it makes it seem like the person is the problem. And we know in this conversation that you're not the problem, right? There's a whole systemic issue at play. All to say, to conclude, I think the ways to implement better accommodation for the person is give them the autonomy back, right? Because so much power is stripped from you during this whole process that by restoring that autonomy and believing you, it gives that comfort to folks saying, I know that I'm in control, right? And we understand what the law is, right? And I could appreciate that some employers and faculty are finding that balance. But being in now was my 5th year of practice, and I've had the privilege of, or the experience, I can't say privilege, of having both a not great healthy workplace and a healthy workplace. I could tell you the biggest difference with that is that I was in control and the autonomy was restored to me.
Cordelia?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Elsa's saying. One thing I would add is also, the importance of being able to have flexibility. I think it goes, and creativity. And I think it goes hand in hand with what Elsa's saying, because if the person is coming to you, I'm coming to you for an accommodation. I can't have that autonomy and power if the options are so constrained. So, with an episodic disability, when I was in school, the choices for me, I had to get, mentioned about that note every semester. I had to get at the beginning of the semester and state what accommodations I would need at the end of the semester, not knowing if I would have an episode or an attack. I needed to say what percentage of time, what percentage of time on the exam might this disability impact? It was completely bizarre. I had no way of answering the questions. When it was presented to me, in terms of what are the barriers that you're facing, what are the concerns that you're facing, and let's work creatively on that. Let's have the professors and instructors also have flexibility in the way that the program is being delivered, such that you may not even need to disclose. That was really empowering.
Allie?
When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking really about the mental health consequences of this whole accommodation process. I know for me, that was a really big barrier in law school, was just how exhausting and it was just a really difficult time. I felt like I was constantly having to explain myself, to educate people, to share way more information than I was comfortable sharing about my disability in order to explain things. And I think the systems that we have in place really don't appreciate how hard that is for students. I think for me, one of the ways of dealing with that was finding community. I think that was a really good part of this disability group we started, was that at least there were other people kind of had that experience together. And then occasionally having people kind of on this, like staff or faculty who were willing to go to bat for me was also really helpful. But I think that's a really big barrier in the accommodation process, is just how much of a toll it can take on the people who are trying to seek accommodations. I think, again, like we've kind of talked about, I don't think there's an easy answer to that without restructuring kind of the whole process. But I do think it's something that on the admin side that programs need to be aware of. It's just how much they're asking for people by asking for all of these things, and thinking through what kind of supports they can put in place to make it, in the interim, a little bit easier for people.
Along a similar line, we've had feedback from some students, especially those that needed more assistance, that navigating the process itself was very difficult and confusing. You have to register with the service, then there's an assessment, and there's this, then this goes to that, then that goes to that, then that goes to that. It's multi-step and can actually be very, very confusing. Any thoughts, any three of you, in terms of how we can, how programs and the services can alleviate that kind of burden?
I think it goes back to a bit of what I was saying earlier, where giving people the information they need up front is so key. So I did some disability organizing in undergrad and in law school, and one of the consistent themes in both was just trying to pull together the learned experience that students with disabilities had at both institutions, both in the formal process. Who do you go to for this? Who do you go to for that? Because I know in my first year, it was okay, well, if there's a physical accessibility problem, I need to go to this person. If there's a timing problem, I need to go to this person. If I need extensions, I have to go to, it was all different. And I think there was nothing clear setting that out. And so in both cases, that was something we worked on creating so that people would have that knowledge about where to go. But again, that's not something that students should have to create. That's something that departments and schools should have available. It shouldn't be a complicated process of figuring out who you need to go to make sure the snow is shoveled, or to make sure you have lecture recordings available. So I think, again, as a stopgap measure, having communities of students being willing to share that knowledge with each other is amazing. But I think really that is information that needs to be transparently provided to students.
I was so spot on. I know when I was seeking accommodation in law school, it was generally come down to, I know a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend who knew a friend who got accommodation, and they told me what to do. And then they tell me another friend and another friend, and it, I make that comedy a bit of Because that's what it felt like, you know? It kind of felt like underground tunnel of information, and it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be that, you know. A coincidence, I went to the library that day and I met someone who told me about their friends of a friend accommodation. It shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be, to be honest, it shouldn't be a stroke of luck that I managed to talk to the right person. And I think that's currently where most of the issues are. They should be really upfront versus kind of where it is at now. My understanding, I haven't lost it on but my audio is not working. Did you guys hear me?
It's been kind of fuzzy, actually.
Okay,
Maybe we'll get.
let me fix it.
Why don't you have a look at that, and we'll get back to it. Yeah, Adelia, any thoughts on the on how to make processes, the accommodations processes, more user friendly?
Yeah. I mean, of course, on the assumption that the first step should be to try and reduce the need for those interactions. But how to make it more friendly? I mean, it really is about the approach. It's about the collective attitude, and recognizing that there is a huge labor in looking for, seeking accommodation. If I disclose, and because it's something that I need in terms of an accommodation, or even in an informal setting for something to be done differently, I usually go and have a good cry afterwards. I can sit on this panel and talk about it with all the confidence in the world, but when I have to go through the process, it's demeaning. It feels awful. I think our human rights law, unfortunately, the way that it's set up is that you have an accommodation or a change for something that seemed to be a deficit, and so you have to walk yourself in there and talk about the things you can't do. And it's incredibly hard. Like, I'm getting emotional now just talking about it, but I try to to put a spin on it to be able to lift myself up to talk about it. I've given it a little nickname, which is the pity parade. You kind of go in there and you bang your little drum and you say, these are the things I can't do, please help me. But it weighs. And I'm looking, as I hear from other folks working in legal practice anyway, in different environments, some organizations now and workplaces are looking at an accessibility passport. And so you don't have to disclose anymore. You don't have to get that note anymore. Rather, you list the impairments, the things that have worked, and you go from manager to manager. That follows with you, and that conversation and that, oh my goodness, I can't do this, doesn't have to happen. I think we'll get at it maybe with some of the other questions, but I feel often like we portray this image of folks, people in general, as either being capable or disabled, and those things can't go together. But we know that that's not true, and yet I feel like I'm being made to jump over here, to one side or the other when I'm asking for an accommodation. I'm no longer capable, I'm disabled, and it sucks.
You're starting to move to another area, and disability passport is actually an interesting concept that I've not heard of. But this has to do with managing the burden or the re-traumatization of repeatedly telling your story and ongoing self-advocacy. Thoughts on that? Delia, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel I did jump ahead a little bit in terms of talking about this. But another thing that I think that's important when we talk about these issues is also, as Ali mentioned at the beginning, the empowering folks to make their decisions. So when I have people come and ask me, should I disclose or shouldn't I disclose, or what should I do? That's really something that, as much as possible, needs to be in the hands of folks who need to make those decisions. So sometimes, I've heard people say, oh, well, post-pandemic, we've got to get everybody in the classroom and so that we can figure out who the people are that we need to help. And that's problematic. I think I'm kind of diverting again, but we have to try and remove a lot of the, those hurdles, the gates and the gatekeepers is a big part of that, because every time we make people go through those multi-step processes, it's again and again and again. So the more we can simplify it, again, that idea of an access passport, it's relatively new, but I think what I like about it is that it's, it puts the authority in the person who's seeking the accommodation. It is about a collective response. It's something that travels with the person as opposed to having to do that again and again. So, I think that might manage some of that having to tell and disclose and deal with all that burden repeatedly.
Ellie?
I was thinking more on the just individual student, like what can you do, I think, to support yourself in that process, and what can you make available for students? I think, again, the availability of community and support from in any way is really helpful. But also I think, having people who are experienced in these processes to help you make the kind of decisions Odelia was talking about. So for example, like when I was looking for summer work, as someone who at the time could only work part-time hours, I would go to the career office and be like, oh, how do I raise this with a potential employer? Like, will they even be able to hire me? I don't know. Met with total silence. No one really had thought about it. No one really knew. It wasn't something that had come up before. And that's fine. But I think usually the conversation ended there until a couple years in, where someone said, you know what, why don't I call a recruiter who's worked with students, and I can at least get a sense of what's available. And I think that helped me figure out when it was really necessary to go into detail and when I should, when I didn't need to, those kinds of questions. And so I think, the more resources that can be available about what your options are, what the pros and cons are of those options, talking to people who have gone through these processes, who've made different decisions. Like, I think all of those things, making those available as resources to students is really important.
Also, if your audio is working better, your thoughts on managing the burden.
Hopefully it's working now. Much better? Oh, awesome. Okay.
Better.
Should have used these headphones from the get-go. So hopefully everyone heard at least a glimmer of what I was trying to say before. But in terms of answering the question, managing the burden and re-traumatizing of retelling your story, I echo a lot of what Ali mentioned previously, which was building the community. And I just want to add to that the barrier at hand for that is there is a preconceived notion that accommodations are A, confidential, and B, individualized. So I've had employers and other institutions tell me we cannot have this person to get some sort of buddy system or some sort of community group supporting them, because that is not individualized and it even breaches confidentiality. And I can appreciate where they're coming from, in the sense that from an employer standpoint, they want to ensure the reduction of liability and there's no harm to their place of business, et cetera, no impending lawsuit, right? But those actually end up being harmful to folks who, for whatever reason, they just may not want to be in a position to re-traumatize themselves, but they may have a trusted ally who they know could advocate for them. But oftentimes that trusted ally is shut and they're told, nope, come back when you bring your friend back in. So, it's a theme, another theme, catch-22. Even if you find a community and an allyship or an ally who will come and vouch for you and support for you, the way the system is geared is individualized and confidential, right? For example, if I get Odelia to advocate for me, my employer or the institution can easily say, well, Odelia is not Elsa, right? Therefore, we're not going to listen to what Odelia is going to tell us about Elsa. And frankly, I could have, I trust Adelia and I could say, listen, I'm giving you permission to advocate for me at this moment because I'm just overwhelmed. Things are not like overwhelming me, right? So there's that presumption that this has to be done alone. And I think that's where a lot of folks end up feeling the burden, having those cry parties, re-traumatizing themselves. And I like to think of it as a balance, And that I will say the law has many folks, there's a lot of problems with the law in terms of human rights code, but remembering that it is still a fine balance. And I always tell folks, accommodation is not a science, it's an art. You know, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and then you have your nice, beautiful painting, right? But it's not an algorithm. I can't punch into numbers, punch into medical forms and just say, you know, I submitted this and therefore it gave me this number, okay? No. All to say, that is my advice on managing, very much echoing Ali's view, but also recognizing there are serious systemic issues at play that prevent community building.
So it sounds like as we move towards the world of AI, we have to be cautious. That it's not an algorithm that may not be a thing that AI
now that you mentioned that, I have so much to say about that, but one thing is the law thrives for objectivity and reasonableness. And I always say, you know, what is reasonable to the employer and the institution may not be suitable for the person, right? And I presume AI is going to do the same thing, right? AI thrives to remove the human aspect of the process, and I think that could cause some harm. But anyways, that's my 2 cents for another panel.
Okay. We've the concept of the theme of balance and balancing things and processes and so on has been in the background of all the discussions. So similar to that, what are your thoughts or tips on managing disclosures around accommodations, and in particular considering the timing, when to disclose and how to disclose? Maybe Ali, we'll start with you.
That's something I thought about a lot when I was looking for work. First, I think questions about when and how to disclose first have to start with recognizing that some people don't have that choice. For some people, no disclosure is necessary. It's either something that's visible or it's something that there's just no way of not talking about it in an employment or an educational setting. And so I think for me, at least previously, like when I really could only work part-time, there was not a should I disclose, it was a how do I, because in law, the assumption is everyone is working more than 8-hour days, right? And so when I'm coming in and saying I can't even do an 8-hour day, like how does that fit onto this paradigm? I know a lot of people who've been in similar situations, and I think what's worked for different people is different. For me, the approach I always took, or after a while, after a couple applications with no success, where I disclosed up front, I stopped doing that because I realized for me it was more effective once I could at least get a foot in the door and have people be invested, and then I could try to bring up that conversation. So typically I would wait till I got an interview offer, or till I'd started the school program or something, and then would start bringing up that kind of information and having those conversations. And for me, that worked well, but I know other people who preferred not to disclose until after they started a job, they were hired, things like that, because, sometimes they just didn't want to have that at all be factoring into the process. For me, I always kind of wanted to know that the end result was going to be okay, that, I would be able to be accommodated. So, before I accepted my offer to go to Osgood, I had to have a conversation that, like, asking about the part-time program. How did this work? Was this going to be feasible for me? But for other people, I think the choice looks different, and I think there's no one right way to do it.
Elsa, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in terms of the question of disclosure, the reality, I'm very much of the opinion with Ali in that from the code perspective, you have the right not to disclose all the details what you have, right? There is a certain amount of autonomy. You should protect yourself. It's okay to focus on the needs you need. For example, let's say I need more, like an additional 30 minutes off or whatever, right? But in terms of disclosure up front, I've found even employers whom I've disclosed from the get-go, they're like, yeah, we're cool with that. And then when it actually comes down to the actual accommodation, they're like, whoa, we actually didn't realize how much work this was. And so all factors considered, I actually, in my experience, found it to be moot. Because, in the workplace that ended up not being the greatest for me, they actually knew from the get-go of my accommodation needs, and they said it was cool. We're cool with that. We're cool parents. We're good. And turns out it was not that. So ultimately, I think you need to preserve your autonomy, preserve your privacy, preserve your confidentiality, because at the end of the day, it's you protecting you, and no one's going to blame you for that. And ultimately, if they're fully committed to retaining you, it's not enough for them to say, yeah, we're accommodation friendly, et cetera, et cetera. It's how have past staff been treated? How have past coworkers been treated? Have you heard anything about this law firm, this medical clinic, this whatever professional setting, right? And so my advice actually is 2 steps forward, which is before when you apply or get an interview or whatnot, talk to folks who worked there before. Do they practice what they preach? On their website, they say they're very inclusive, but are they? And that, I think, could reveal a lot. So I'm currently in the clinic system, and I will say at my current clinic, I'm very fortunate where things are working in my favor. And that is because prior to entering, I had conversations with former staff who all said the same thing. You're in good hands, you can work with this, et cetera, right? So, yeah, so to conclude, in terms of disclosure, ultimately, if you do disclose or not, it really doesn't matter, because I do think at the end of the day, many institutions will promise that they will accommodate, or, they like the idea that they will accommodate. But I think the reality is talking to former staff, current staff, or anyone who has knowledge of that workplace will be the biggest insight for you. And for example, I've been helping another young law student who is now entering the workforce. And she asked me, I got an interview with XYZ firm. What have you heard of them? And I've heard great things. And I told them, look, I've heard great things. I'm not telling you what to disclose, but I'm telling you I've heard great things. And they decided to disclose, and it ended up working beautifully for them. The firm stepped up, worked with them, and that's because I vouched on what the knowledge I've heard from other community members. So I think to protect yourself, know that there is a community out there who probably has experienced very similar things that you're seeking. So tap into that.
Odelia, your thoughts on disclosure?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of what's already been said. I never, again, as I mentioned before, I tell people what the benefits and drawbacks of disclosure are, because there are benefits too, right? There's burnout when you don't disclose. And so people need to know that because of all the labor involved. And there's also, for me, I found that disclosing at the point in time when I decided to disclose publicly is a bit empowering, because there's this dynamic, right, where I disclose my disability and nobody's supposed to know about it, and I'm always worried that piece of me is going to be revealed, and who gets to make those decisions? Well, now I get to make those decisions because I've decided, but I wouldn't have been able to do that in law school. That was an impossibility. But now, I mean, I want to see disability as something that's valued. So when people disclose. It's like, oh, so you've got this experiential knowledge, and maybe we all benefit from having you here, and you're pretty, not because you managed to do this with a disability, but you're pretty amazing, and people are all different, and I want to hear more about the solutions that you've come up with and how we can change how we're collectively doing things. There's kind of this assumption of either being a capable professional or disabled. And I want to question that dichotomy, because I don't think it's fair to anybody. I saw a question in the chat that talked about, dealing with students when they're coming forward for accommodation. Is it possible for me to kind of answer that now, or do you want to, because it's a little bit related, which is what I imagine the response to be when someone discloses. Like an ideal. That was actually
going to be the next question in terms of navigating from the learning environment to the work environment in that area.
So maybe maybe pose it to us, and if I can start with a response, then we'll pick up there.
All right, sounds good. So let me pose the question. I was going to say is that most of us, not all of us, work with learners in the learning environment, and obviously, some learners towards the end of their learning journey and making the transition into the workplace. So how did you navigate the transition from the learning environment to the workplace regarding your accommodations, and any thoughts or insights? So Adelia, why don't you start with that and piggyback in the other thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I was referring to the question that was in the Q&A, if that's been posted by somebody in the audience.
Sure, why don't you start with that one and then talk about the learning to work environment transition.
Okay, so if I'm going to answer that one, because I mean the question had to do with how to manage students when they're coming in and not being prescriptive in terms of what the accommodations are, but also being there to assist them. I think, if I'm getting the gist of that. But for me, it was hugely beneficial to have folks in the accessibility advising role who, number one, had taken it upon themselves to really have a lot of information about what the options were. Not to have somebody look at me like, oh, well, this is a new problem. How am I going to deal with that? Even if they didn't know. So take a break, come back in a few days. I will have the answers for you. And also being an ally for me, so that office can take some of the advocacy and leadership role in terms of making change. It doesn't have to fall on my shoulders. That it's about my individual circumstances, but also more broadly, how to make the institution more accessible. And I know that that's the approach that's being taken. When I think about the question of disclosure and a lot of the things that we're talking about, whether it's in an education setting or in a workplace setting, I imagine kind of an ideal response to a disclosure. I always start, no matter the setting, I always start with a thank you. Like, I know that there was labor there, that took a lot for you to say, and so thank you. And then, recognizing that the folks who are in these programs are there because they deserve to be. So thank you for disclosing. You deserve to be there. That's something you need to know. That the system is imperfect, that we're going to together encounter structural barriers, that I'm on your side with this is really important, and also that we'll do our best to figure things out, but we can revisit it and improve. And if the accommodations don't work, then we'll sort that out again. In terms of that broader issue about fear from moving from one setting to another, and the accommodations and stigma related to that, sometimes I think that we forget that accommodation, and I think also accessibility and inclusion, when we're making broader change, is actually to promote the ability of a person to be part of a collective and be productive. It's not antithetical. It's, I am more productive because the accommodations or the accessibility is there. It's not one or the other.
Also, question around transitioning from learning to work environment and accommodations.
Adelia said a lot of what I wanted to say, but I will just quickly add I'm going to be honest. My advice is to be gentle with yourself because it may be a bit of a struggle. And I say that as someone who I had a struggle. So just when I kind of figured out my momentum in law school of the accommodation process, I felt like I went kind of back into the skating rink, was out my skates and just falling and burning out quickly. And so be gentle with yourself. Recognize that workplace probably isn't for you, right? And I think that's something that I've had to accept myself, that you also want to find a space that you're going to reach your full potential, right? And frankly, recognizing that you have way more to give to this world and to the workforce. And if no one sees that potential, then, kind of like LeBron James, bring my talents elsewhere. But that's kind of what I had to tell myself to cope, right? Because the reality is it's still unacceptable, especially in 2024, that we have workplaces that don't get it, right? I hold a high standard to folks saying, in the age of technology, in the age of social media where everyone's sharing everything, you should know better now about the lived experience of folks with disabilities and just the systems at place, right? But while that may be wishful thinking on my end, my first transition from school to work was a bit of a struggle. And now I've found 5 years into my practice, I found momentum on what I'm looking for. So, and as cheesy as it sounds, when I'm interviewing, they're not just interviewing me rather, I'm interviewing them. I'm asking questions on their accommodation process, their policy. I don't think it's wrong to look at their employee guidebook and ask questions from there. And I think that has empowered me to kind of regain that agency without disclosing, I'm asking because of this personal reason of mine. No, I want to still preserve that personal piece of me. That said, I'm a professional. We're all professionals. I'm going to look at the employee handbook and ask questions, right? And usually I find, I don't know if it's a cross-examination to me, but when you start looking at that employee guidebook or any information that they have on their website, it reveals a lot more of the employer, and it helps guide whether or not you want to work there or not. And I know even that's a privilege, under saying if you want to work there or not, because the truth is some folks just accept any job just to kind of get their name out there, reputation out there, any work experience. So I also recognize I'm saying this as someone who is now 5 years in. But yeah, so be gentle with yourself because it could be a struggle. It was a struggle for me, and I'm very transparent about that. I've had very close moments where I wanted to just quit law and just say I'm done with this. But then I realized once you find the right workplace, it's not you. Frankly, it's them. It's the most cheesy way to think of it.
Ali, any additional thoughts in how to facilitate that transition from learning to work environment?
I have a couple of things. I think thinking about in terms of like the educational programs themselves, I think for me, reflecting back, one of the most helpful things for me in figuring out how to transition from school to practice was that I had done like clinical and experiential education in law school. Because for me, what that did was it meant I had the opportunity to work in a workplace environment while still in school and could kind of figure out, okay, when I'm not in school, when I'm working, which looks a little bit different, what actual accommodations do I need? How does that look different than what I need in school? And also I could then use that in talking to future employers to say, okay, like here's these accommodations that have worked for me in the past. Or, you might have concerns about my ability to do this because of my part-time status. Like, let me explain how I did this, like those kinds of things. And so I think facilitating those as options where they're possible, but also I think giving students that information and kind of seeing it through that lens of using that to figure out, how you can operate in a workplace environment, I found really, really helpful. And I think the other thing is, I think there's often this assumption that schools will necessarily be more flexible and accommodating than the real world. And I think sometimes that's true. Like some people have the transition to workplace that's much more difficult. I think for me, I found the opposite was true. I found that my school experience was much more restrictive and inflexible and prescribed about what kind of accommodations were available to me, versus when I was working, I just kind of got a response of, you know, as long as you get everything you need to get done, we don't care what time you're working. You know, we're not sitting here monitoring your hours. You don't need to be in a chair at this time and this time. And again, that's not how it is for everyone. And so, but I did find that I think once I got my foot in the door in terms of, you know, convincing employers that it was worth hiring me as someone who couldn't work full-time hours, the actual experience for me went much more smoothly than it did trying to convince people at law school that that was what I needed. And so I think there was some element of like fear that had been instilled in me from this attitude towards accommodations that, you know, the real world will be different, that I think should not be there.
Good to know the transition to the real world doesn't have to be scary, and it can actually be welcoming. Let's move on. Also going to start with you. Any current trends that you're seeing in the world of EDIA, especially regarding accommodations?
Did you say me? Okay,
Yes.
I just want to double check. I'm like, hopefully my audio's not giving problems anymore. Okay, so current trends, and perhaps I could even offer my own insight as an employment lawyer. I've seen a lot of, let's reduce the workload, right? Okay, we'll reduce the workload. Instead of giving you XYZ files or tasks, we'll give you maybe a couple less or whatever you need, right? But, you know, it still doesn't get, and I find in certain professions, there's a couple things, especially for professions like law, medicine, nursing, anywhere where there's a professional governing regulatory body, the obligations and the stress is still there though. Like even if I have one file, two files, or, you know, one patient, two patients, I still have the duty to serve them, right? And that is very stressful. So I often think to myself, even the trends of reducing the workload, yeah, that's great. But even that sometimes may not be great, because I've had folks tell me, you know, it feels patronizing. It feels like I can't do the work, right? And especially episodic disabilities where, let's say today is a great day, you could take on as many as you can do. But then tomorrow's not a great day. That doesn't really take into account with the current trends of let's just reduce the workload and just kind of, you know, reduce the influx of patients or clients we get just to work with that. And I don't think that's perfect. For many things, it assumes disability, you need less work, which, to be very blunt, that's not true. People operate in different ways. Again, some days are better, some days are not. And it should just be it should be a conversation as by ad hoc and see how things go. But another trend I'm seeing, and this is maybe more systemic, I don't know if there's a word, the whitewashing of disability, I call it, right? Removing the intersectionalities at play, you know, recognizing that even when I think about accommodations, so I'm thinking of some folks in my work or my practice as an employment lawyer where they're focused on the disability, right? Okay, let's, get her extra 30 minutes. Let's get her an extra, I don't know, like an extra computer monitor, whatever, right? But she may be experiencing social determinants of health, right? Her housing's falling apart. She can't provide for her family because wage disparity between certain groups is much lower, right? But also we know about the impact of colonization, the impact of racism. these are things that, I can't fill out in a form and say like, I want this. So I find the current trends lack that. The current trends of accommodation, of accommodation proposals lack that crucial intersectionality and social determinants of health that we should be mindful of, right? So and again, maybe, I'm pretty open and honest about my life. So, for example, I've been helping my parents who are low income with their housing situation, right? And I know I had a good conversation with my boss, and it was a moment of, what do you need? And I want to tell her, I just need her landlord to smarten up and stop playing games like this, right? And, we had a good laugh because the truth is, I have a great rapport with my boss where she felt like, okay, let's knock on his door and just get some results in the housing situation. But I think about that. I think about the accommodation and the whitewashing, stripping the colonization, stripping the racism and the systemic issues at place. And so hopefully that answers your questions. I could go on about that more, but that's the current trend I see, and it's not even current. I think it's pretty much been in the forefront for a long time. And hopefully the next wave, we learn from that mistake and we incorporate all these contextual factors.
Natalie, over to you. Regarding trends, agree with Elsa, different trends?
One thing I think I've noticed is because, universities, education programs are now more aware of disability than they were in the past. I think to some extent there's a bit of complacency and there's a bit of this sense that we have it all figured out now. So we know what the possible accommodations are. We know what people might need. We know what the processes are to get those to them. Here's what we do. And I think we've all kind of alluded to this at different points in talking about our experiences, but, nothing can be broken down into a series of checkboxes. There wouldn't have been a checkbox on Elsa's accommodation form that says you can bring lavender. There wasn't a checkbox on my bar examination accommodation request that said I can bring a yoga mat to lie down on the floor. So there needs to be some kind of, I think, moving away from these like predetermined, here's the options, and much more into a talk about what it would look like to make this more accessible for you, and let's see how we can get there. And I think the second one is I have definitely been noticing a bit of a rise in suspicion around accommodations. I mean, it's always there, but I feel like the number of headlines I've seen recently, rich children getting ADHD diagnoses for extra time in school, or those kinds of things. I just feel like I've seen a lot more of that in the past couple of years. And I don't know, maybe that's a backlash because we're recognizing disability more and getting people what they need. But I think, I've seen institutions and people in positions of authority play into that kind of language and that kind of view of accommodation and disability. And I think that is definitely a troubling trend.
Julia?
Yeah. I agree with what's been said. I'm thinking also in terms of some of the trends that we're seeing now as we've kind of been through a global pandemic and then coming out of it, because when it wasn't just the folks with disabilities who were impacted in terms of needing that workplace flexibility and timing flexibility, and and everybody needed to be able to work from home. Essentially, it was provided, and now we're seeing like this huge dial back and pressure. The structures that we had started putting in place, which were not new to folks like me in terms of needing the flexibility and being able to work from home and connect virtually. Those things that were put in place are now being regarded as no longer necessary, when really what we should be learning is, hey, there are all kinds of ways that we can get to the same objective by giving this inclusive, accessible way of being part of a community, of being a student, of doing work. So that's, the language and the way that that's being talked about is concerning to me. I think we're at a moment where we actually can, we still have a potential for tremendous change in terms of inclusion and accessibility. I was talking about this actually at a conference recently with folks who are doing labor law, and somebody had this story of somebody coming forward for a work from home accommodation, and then they were granted that accommodation, but in exchange they were told they can no longer be allowed to come back into the workplace. And I'm seeing that also in terms of policies in different settings where exclusion is being disguised as accommodation. Exclusion is never inclusion. It is antithetical. And so I worry a lot about that kind of approach. Now we're, if you cannot participate in this particular way, then you cannot participate at all. If we have concerns about your ability to manage as a student, then we'll give you a break by stripping you of your student status, which in a way actually happened to me. I've lost my full-time status as a student as a result of impacts on intersectional issues from the pandemic. So now I'm a part-time student, and I've lost all of the privileges that come with that, which have now presented additional barriers to me. So kind of this moment in time, and in relation to what Elsa said, that intersectional approach is so important. I could approach my institution and say, this is these are my disability related accommodations, but I'm also a parent, and for a good portion of the pandemic, I was a single parent of a very young child, and the disability and the parenting, the school had no ability to figure out what to do with me as a single parent who had a disability during a global health pandemic. I was offered funds, but I didn't have any way, there was no way for me to spend those funds to actually relieve the issues that I was facing. And so I know it's tricky, right? Because in the institutional setting, you're splitting. This is the disability accommodation office, and this is the office for Indigenous students, and right, but it doesn't work that way in real life. And when those overlaps happen, it presents kind of these impossible scenarios. So I wish it would be a trend, as was expressed by both Ali and Elsa, that there's more of an intersectional approach to dealing with solutions. But I think it's highlighted coming out of the pandemic. And I see some real important conversations happening right now.
Just to quickly jump in, one of the most eye-opening conversations I had about this was a colleague who, when it was on the news about the discovery of graves for residential schools, it's, how are you doing? And they looked at me and like, I don't know what to say to that, because I found my own kin, my own kin was missing. And it had a moment of humility, but it also reminded me of, like, you cannot tell the person, go to the mental health office or disability accommodation office is right there in floor 3, and go to, whatever like office you need, and they're all intersectional, right? So in this particular case, it was a good example of the impact of colonization and the ongoing impact and accommodation in disability, mental health. And I just, looking back, you cannot remove yourself from that. You cannot just put it in checklists, right? And so in that particular example, I know they, without any questions asked, they let the person do whatever they wanted and just say, listen, take the day off if you need. We trust that you're, kind of like what Ali noted, we trust that you will do whatever you need to do to finish your task, but do what is right to preserve your own happiness, right? And I don't know if you could get that in the education setting, right? That I think could be a much more steeper uphill when we're talking about the transition from school to work. I find that work, for the most part, will give you that room to breathe as long as you complete whatever task you need. Whereas I think in an education settings, like kind of what Adelia noted, it becomes very difficult.
Thank you. Just conscious of the time, maybe we'll just do one final question and we'll just ask each panel member to keep your replies down to about a minute or so, just so that we have a little bit of time for addressing any questions in the chat. So what we hear sometimes is that programs, workplaces, the general public, they're afraid. They're saying, with so many more people requiring workplace accommodations, what impact is that going to have on the workforce? Who's going to do the work? How do we manage that? How do we keep work going if so many people are going to need accommodations? So your thoughts, your responses to that, and Adelia, we'll start with you.
Sure. I've kind of alluded to it before. I actually think that the trend is the problem is the other way, that it's not that more people are needing accommodation, but rather that our workplaces and larger kind of institutions are becoming increasingly inflexible and kind of wanting to have this kind of these narrow ways of doing things, and if you don't fit into one of these, then it's becoming a problem. And so the more we're trying to regiment and make the processes of work and learning kind of fall into these regimented ways of doing things, the more people are going to fall outside of the ability to be within that. So that's where the problem is. It's not that more people are in need of accommodation because there's more, we've always been here. We've always been unique and different. The systems are problematic. But the other thing that I said before is that productivity and accommodation are not antithetical. When we accommodate, when we make room for more people, that's actually part of allowing them to contribute to the productivity. I think about the design of Grand Central Station in New York as an example, where there are no stairs. And it was designed that way on purpose because they wanted to have people move through the train station, many people, quickly and efficiently. And it's by design accessible and inclusive. It's not antithetical. We can design things in a way that is welcoming so that everybody can have a role in being part of our workplaces, our schools, etc.
Thank you. Yeah. Ollie, your thoughts?
I think in brief, my thoughts are that, sometimes it will take a change. It will take a change in how things are structured. But I think, as Adelia said, the issue is not more people getting accommodations, it's that suddenly people who previously wouldn't have been able to access certain professions, certain schools, certain jobs, now have the opportunity to do that. And it's like, how do we then make the workplaces, make the schools catch up and be less exclusionary? Like when I was looking into programs for after undergrad, I didn't know if I'd be able to go to law school. There were other professional programs that didn't have a part-time option that I had to rule out. And I think, the issue, of more workplace accommodations could be a problem, but I just think that's on employers to figure out. That's what it means to be operating in the world, is figuring out ways to, adhere to the laws and to include people. And I think, it's just doing people a real disservice to boil it down to you are making things more complicated. When I think that's just the wrong attitude to have towards people with disabilities in general.
Also,
I'll quickly add, my mindset for this has always been hold power accountable and follow who has the power in the situation. And usually it's the institutions. And so, when I hear more and more people are seeking accommodations, I'm not going to put the blame on the people. I'm going to go back to the power and be like, I think it's just revealing the cracks in your system, right? So, I always try to think of it like that. And so when folks try to, put it on the folks, I say, listen, I think it's just revealing the pre-existing cracks that have always been there. Many folks, advocates, have been saying this for decades, and it's just coming to light now. So I'm optimistic, though. I think the new generation of students and workers, and we say Gen Z, are just unstoppable. And I have a couple of friends who have Gen Z kids, and I can tell you they are unstoppable. And so I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that things are going to move in the right direction. And I think the new generation especially now knows now know the systems at place and are holding truth to power, and they're asking questions that were previously told not to ask.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I just quickly summarize the themes that I kind of heard in the discussion today. A lot of it seemed to focus around the move from looking at the individual to looking at the community and the collective, and in particular in issues around awareness, education. But I've also heard a lot about don't wait for the individual to ask for accommodations, but really think more as we make that shift more around accessibility by design, and plan it in, and so that situations and opportunities are available to everyone right from the get-go, rather than people having to bear the burden of advocating for themselves. And I'd say the other important thing that I heard the panelists say is to really actually beware of when we think we got it, when we think we're there, because that's a bit of a dangerous place to be, because then that stops us thinking. It stops us moving forward. And, so we think we're there because we have the checklist of the steps you have to go through, but actually we've missed nuances, we've missed context, and we've actually missed, if you will, the spirit of what's supposed to be happening. So hopefully I've done justice to what each of you has talked about today. We are 2 minutes to 3, so I don't know if there's an opportunity to address any questions. I will leave it up to our MC.
I don't hear anything, so I assume we're good to go.
I'm going to jump in just given the time, and we'll move to the next presentation. But thank you so much, Dr. Pignatello, for moderating, and our panelists as well. Also, Delia and Ali, thanks so much for such a thought-provoking discussion. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So for our next session, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Sezgi Ozel, and I'm the team lead of the on-location graduate and professional faculties team at Accessibility Services at UofT St. George. I'm a white woman in my early 30s with long dark brown hair. It's currently mostly straight, and I'm wearing a black long sleeve shirt. My background is a fake office room. For our next session, we have representatives from University of British Columbia, Vancouver joining us to talk about their best practices for supporting students in the health profession. So to introduce them, we have Joey Offray. She is an accessibility advisor at the Center for Accessibility, University of British Columbia, Vancouver. Joey has over 10 years of experience in higher education, working in a number of student affairs units on campus. At the Center for Accessibility, she supports students in the health science professions, including the undergraduate and postgraduate medical education programs. Joey Ellison has a Master's of Social Work degree from the University of British Columbia, a Bachelor of Social Work Indigenous Specialization from the University of Victoria, and a BA Political Science from the University of British Columbia. Jolie is an accessibility advisor at the Center for Accessibility, University of British Columbia, Vancouver, primarily working with students in the health science professions and Indigenous undergraduate students at UBC. We ask that you please save your questions until the end, but in the meantime, you can continue to type your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have some time at the end for our presenters to respond to as many as possible. So now I'll pass it over to Joey and Jolie, and just a friendly reminder for you both to please provide a visual description of yourselves as part of your introduction.
Thank you so much for that introduction. We're very happy to be here today presenting to everyone. I think I have slide access. There we go. Oh, there we go. My name is Joey Offray. I am an East Asian woman in my mid-30s, and my pronouns are she, her. I am wearing a white top today with dark brown glasses, and I have long black and brownish hair. And I will now pass it over to my co-presenter to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jolie Ellison. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an Indigenous woman with light skin, and I have long brown and gray hair. I'm 55 years old, so mid-50s, and I'm wearing glasses today. I'm wearing a black shirt and a black sweater, and I'm very pleased to be here.
So first off, I would like to share that I am presenting to you remotely today from Richmond, British Columbia, which, like the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. The land that the campus is situated on has been a place of learning for the Musqueam community, who have passed on their language, traditions, and history and culture through many generations. The picture we have chosen to include here today on the slide is a picture of the reconciliation pole in process of being raised according to Haida tradition on April 1st, 2017. The reconciliation pole is a 55-foot red cedar pole that was carved by Edenshaw James Hart, the Haida hereditary chief and a master carver. The pole itself tells the story of the time both before, during, and after the Indian residential school system, as probably most folks here know, a system that began in Canada in the 1800s and ended with the last school closure in 1996. And I just wanted to share that as a settler on these lands, I encourage you to also consider how we challenge colonial systems in healthcare and health education, and how we can continue to decolonize our work. As we go through this presentation today, just thinking about that and thinking of any kind of active steps that you and your institutions and your programs can contribute to this. We do have some resources at the end of our presentation that you can refer to, that can be a starting point. And for folks who may have not been to our campus before, I do encourage you to come to campus to see the reconciliation pole in person, as well as visit the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, which our team did an educational tour of a few months back during one of our staff development days. So an overview of our presentation for today. Firstly, we'll be providing a bit of an overview of our office and the services to provide some context to situate the work that Jolie and I do. We'll provide a brief overview of the legal policy and the framework. Then we'll talk more about our approach from the University of British Columbia to supporting students in the health professions. And then we will talk about accommodations, both from pre-admissions to the clinical context. Similar to other sessions, as our host shared at the beginning, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them towards the end of our presentation. You'll also notice that we have some links embedded throughout our presentation. And hopefully with the PDF slides you've already received, you'll be able to click through those links if you're interested in learning more about what's shared on those links, as well as we will have a list of resources at the end of our presentation as well. So first off, I wanted to share that our office, the Center for Accessibility, we work with students with permanent or long-term disabilities or medical conditions to determine and facilitate the accommodations based on the impacts of those conditions in all aspects of UBC life. So this can include academic accommodations, so in the exam setting, classroom settings, in the clinical context, support services such as access to parking or priority housing, as well as academic concessions. Also, we provide support to instructors, faculties, and other university partners and leadership to the university community on issues on systemic disability, as well as other accommodation-related issues. So here we have a photo of the Center for Accessibility office team. I am newer to the team, so I'm actually not in the photo, but you can imagine me there. So a bit of an overview of our office. We have a management team that consists of a director, associate directors, and operations managers. And there are 13 accessibility advisors who are in the same role as Jolie and myself, but working with students in other programs. We have an arts plus portfolio and a science plus portfolio, and with Jolie and myself are situated within the science plus portfolio. But we also have on the Arts Plus portfolio advisors that work specifically with graduate students that are in graduate programs outside of the health profession students that we work with. We also have a lot of support staff that work in our Center for Accessibility team. So we have a dedicated accommodated exam center, so in a staff team that works there. We have a team that works on alternate format. We have coordinators that coordinate campus accessibility, such as parking and our accessibility shuttle. We have a student assistant coordinator who hires and trains and recruits student assistants such as note takers, tutors, and other assistants. We have a learning strategist who both hosts ongoing workshops for our students as well as one-on-one brief learning strategy consults. We have an administrative team who supports the various administrative processes within our office. And we have advisors who work specifically on priority housing and admissions, which are any disability related admissions considerations for undergraduate programs primarily. And then we have over 1,000 student assistants who work with us in various roles, so such as note takers, tutors, visual access assistants, as well as alt format too. So we have found that having a centralized accessibility office really helps ensure the consistency of decision making and the outcomes for students, as well as provides confidentiality for students' medical information, as that information is not shared outside of our office. All folks outside of our office, as relevant, would know about a student is that they're registered with our office, but not the reasons why they are registered with our office. And having our centralized accessibility services office also helps the faculties avoid being put in a potential conflict of interest situation where they might be asked to both accommodate and academically evaluate the student. So before I talk a bit about the demographics of the students who are registered with our office and this pie chart that's in front of you, I just wanted to note that, as probably many of the folks in this presentation know, to keep in mind both person first and identity first language when we're discussing issues of disability and how it varies depending on the person and the group. So person first language being language that emphasizes the person, and identity first language focuses on the person's disability identity. Obviously, when possible, ask the person in the group which one they preferred and use what they prefer, and you'll note that throughout the presentation we'll be using both types of language. So to describe what's in the pie chart that's in front of you, this is the demographics of the students that were registered with us last April 2023. We're in the process of pulling the stats for this past academic year now. At that point, we had approximately 5,500 students registered with our office. The number is probably a bit higher, I would guess, for this year at this point. As you can see, around 48% of the students are registered with us for mental health, 18% for ADHD, 12% for chronic health, learning disabilities make up 8%, neurological disabilities for 5%, physical disabilities 4%, students registered with ASD 2%, hearing disabilities 2%, visual disabilities 1%. Around 16% of these students identify with multiple conditions, 7% of these students would be graduate students, and 24% of these students are international students. Here, the next slide that I have here is another diagram indicating the trends of registration with our office over the last 10 academic years. As you can see, there is a slight increase at around the year 2020 due to a global event that we are all very familiar with and with the impacts of. But overall, you can see that the increase of registrants since the establishment of the original Disability Resource Center in 1998 has increased. Due to the increase in 2020, due to COVID and the rise of students with disabilities attending post-secondary have gone up in terms of academic accommodations in the school settings. Students are more aware of their needs and their rights, and have been successful in being admitted to undergraduate programs with accommodations, and increasingly are applying to and being admitted into the health programs.
Thanks, Joey. So in the professional health programs, we have about 400 students registered with our office, and those students are distributed between Joey and myself. So we've got a large number of health programs at UBC, as you can see from the slide. Joey and I share all of those students, except for in terms of medical students and postgraduate medical residents. Joey works with all of those students, and I work with all of the students in the pharmacy programs. The rate of registration in terms of the health professions is higher than undergraduate students, and as probably as many people in the audience know, there are several reasons for that. In particular, we know that when students register in the health programs and have disabilities, there's higher stakes for students who are registering in the health programs in terms of degree progression, program progression, and ensuring that you're passing all of your courses and your clinical placements in a timely manner in order to proceed with your program along with your cohort. In terms of undergraduate programs, there's less at risk if a student may be having difficulties in a particular course, or if they happen to, fail a course in your undergraduate degree, it doesn't have the significant effect that it does in a health program. So that's one of the reasons why students are more likely to register with our office once they're admitted to a health profession. Also, students are more mature, maybe more comfortable understanding their disability, and more comfortable in knowing their rights as a student with a disability in receiving accommodations. The other professional programs at the university we know have the higher rates of registration as well. So law and education tend to be higher percentages as well. And we've had significant growth in the numbers, as Joey showed in that last slide, in terms of registration with our office. So growth due to, of course, the pandemic. We've seen a lot of increase in registration since 2020 for a variety of reasons, but also around practicum accommodations. So in the past, students didn't know that practicum accommodations were even possible. Programs, especially in Canada, weren't providing accommodations or weren't providing that information to students around accessing accommodations and the availability of accommodations, both in being admitted to programs, the admission process, and then clinical accommodations once you're in the program. So that's provided for some significant growth as well. So at UBC, we use a legal and policy framework to guide our work. We do base our framework on the BC Human Rights Code and the Accessible British Columbia Act, which talks about the UBC's legal duty to accommodate persons with disabilities. At UBC, we have policy LR7, which is the disability accommodation policy. And basically that talks about what the university's responsibilities are as a whole university. So as a whole community, everyone is responsible for making sure that members of our community know about accommodations, know about the Center for Accessibility, know what their rights are, and that they're referred so that staff and faculty beyond our office are well aware of the right of students and the responsibility of staff across campus to refer students if needed to our office. And then the responsibility of instructors to make sure that they are providing the appropriate accommodations that have been assessed by our office, and that they're working with our office in order to implement accommodations if there are any issues or concerns around those. And then it is the student's responsibility to follow our processes. So making sure that students, register with our office in a timely manner, download accommodation letters, and provide that information to their instructors or faculty as needed. So again, when we're talking about accommodations, the types of things I'm going to mention are things that have been mentioned already today in earlier sessions. But just remembering that accommodations are meant to provide equitable access. They're not meant to ensure success. It's definitely not an advantage for any student to have accommodations. Also, they're expected to be reasonable. So, we evaluate or assess for reasonable accommodations. So they're not meant to be a perfect accommodation for any student. And I don't think any students or many students think that they are receiving perfect accommodations, to be honest. It's a very individualized assessment at UBC. So we look at, we look at the student's medical documentation. We listen to their narrative, to their lived experience. We do recognize that students are experts on their lived experience. So we take all of that information into account, and we think about the program the student is in, whereabouts in the program they are, what stage they're at in the program. And then we, come up with accommodations that will reduce the barriers to access for those students. Accommodations are not meant to undermine or remove any fundamental learning outcomes. They definitely don't remove the need for evaluation, but they can modify the way that students are evaluated, and they can modify the way that students reach the essential learning outcomes of their programs. So we have a duty to accommodate. And again, this was discussed in the earlier session by Springer, just about that legal duty to accommodate, except in certain circumstances. So in particular, the undue hardship. And as Sari mentioned, like financial hardship, especially at an institution like the University of British Columbia, where we have a large endowment, we have a lot of resources. I've never experienced a situation where we would have, where we could meet the undue hardship for financial reasons. Administrative hardships, I have seen us reach an administrative hardship threshold in this particular case, but it does mean it's got to be beyond an inconvenience. It can't just be programs saying we don't have enough staff, or it would take us a long time to implement a particular accommodation. It does need to meet a very high threshold. Patient safety, again, when concerns about patient safety arise, it can't be speculative. It can't be just, I'm concerned about how the student may behave when they're in a clinical placement. There does have to be demonstrated issues that we can outline and understand where patient safety may be a concern. And then, of course, an accommodation can't compromise a bona fide requirement of a program. Why is it important to include students with disabilities in our programs? And I think that, we all generally know, or we can understand the ethical reasons behind this, being an inclusive and providing an inclusive environment for all learners. But we, in our office at UBC, we really look to Lisa Meeks, Dr. Lisa Meeks, who's an expert on accessibility and inclusion in medical education. She's works at the University of Michigan, and she's the executive director of the Docs with Disabilities podcast, of Docs with Disabilities website and program podcast. Multiple resources available on that website if people are unaware of her work so far. But this is a quote from her, and talking about how there's a lot of research out now that shows how patient outcome is improved when patients are served by healthcare professionals who have disabilities or who have similar disabilities to the patients they're serving. So it's really about providing culturally competent care and improving patient outcomes. So we want to be an inclusive, accessible environment, and we know that improves care for everyone, improves the workplace for everyone, and it improves patient outcomes. When I was working in one particular case with a student who's in the audiology and speech sciences program, her clinical educators came to me and they were concerned about how is the student going to be successful in this program. And they said there's so many barriers and they didn't know how to improve the student's clinical experience. And so one of the things that we talked about was how the clinical preceptors could change their perspective around, it was sort of, instead of thinking the student was lacking, maybe we could talk about how this was an opportunity for the clinical educators to develop their professionalism. So some professional development on the behalf of the clinical educators, and this was an opportunity for them to improve their learning, to improve their teaching style, and to think about how they were creating their barriers in the process of their more typical learning or teaching styles, as opposed to placing all of the responsibility on the student. And that was helpful in sort of reframing the issues with the clinical educators. I'll pass it back to Joey.
Thanks, Jolie. Now I'm going to talk a bit about getting into our approach and how we work with students and support students in the health professions. As you can see from this diagram, there are 4 key groups of folks that are involved in this process. So one being the student, and as Jolie shared earlier, the student has responsibilities to initiate this process, to reach out to our office. We, as accessibility advisors in the Center for Accessibility Staff, play a part of this process. And it's important that our team, and Jolie and I in particular, and the other advisors we work with, we do need to be an expert in disability justice so that we're able to recognize and address as well institutional and individual biases when it comes to working with students with disabilities. Advisors need to know the programs they're working with. So in particular, Jolie and I, we need to familiarize ourselves with over a dozen of the health profession programs at UBC. Our office team in particular needs to be nimble. We need to be able to react quickly as situations come up. And as well, us advisors need to know outside of the university, who can we reach out to across North America to discuss complex cases, what has worked for specific programs. Jolie and I are part of the working group of BC-based disability resource advisors, as well as being a part of a number of different listservs where folks pitch out questions to get answers from the community. That's really important for us as supports as advisors as well. The academic programs themselves also need to be willing to be nimble and make last minute changes, as well as advocate for the students. They also need to consider, that's as Jolie just shared, that students with disabilities may offer professional learning opportunities for clinical educators in clinical placements as well. And then in the clinical environment, so that could be clinical educators, the support staff at the various sites, such as scheduling staffs, IT staff, folks that work for the health authorities. They need to know kind of what the care communication channels are between the university and the preceptors in the program. What information do they need to know to be able to support the implementation of these accommodations for the students that are learning at their sites? As you saw from the statistics that Jolie shared earlier about the health programs, as those numbers increase, our office found the need to restructure how we support students, creating the dedicated team of advisors, us, versus a student meeting with any advisor in the office with the expectation that they would be familiar with all the health programs at UBC. Each program has specialized requirements, timelines, and probably most importantly, so much of our work depends on the relationships that we have with the program staff. And relationship building amongst 13 advisors is a lot more challenging than relationship between 2 advisors. So with this context, we wanted to share some key components of our approach that hopefully has made a difference in terms of the support we are able to provide for the students that we work with. So first off, we want to talk about increasing the knowledge for students of the program and staff in the clinical environment about the accommodation process. This really is from the point of recruitment. Students need to know that the program is welcoming and inclusive, and that there is a process for applying for accommodations, and that it is not an afterthought or coming from a place, and that this entire process is coming from a place where we know the student is capable and will contribute their strengths to the program, much of like what the panel that we just saw shared. We meet regularly with the program staff of the programs, either to discuss specific cases and accommodations or to check in on overall processes to see how things are going. We also have presented to the program teams as well as clinical educators about our office and the accommodation process, as well as the legal policy and frameworks that they might not be familiar with. And part of these conversations sometimes is about bringing forward issues of ableism and other systemic issues, so that outside of discussing individual cases, we can really always be critically looking at how we can improve and reduce barriers as much as possible for the students that we work with. Some of the most productive meetings I would say I've had personally about clinical accommodations have been where I'm in meetings with, for example, with undergraduate medicine, with the clerkship director, as well as the assistant dean of student affairs, as well as the students, so that we can better understand and everyone be on the same page about what policies and procedures might already be built into the program and what needs to actually look like an accommodation. For example, sometimes I will learn that for one rotation, a post-call day is already going to be offered to a student if they stay on call until a certain time. So an accommodation for post-call day might only need to be in place if a student is leaving earlier. So it's about kind of having those conversations so that we understand what already exists and where might we step in to support the students and reduce the barriers in these contexts. This is going to be important for folks that are organizing their accessibility offices or are looking at a review of how they can organize their accessibility offices. We found that timely support is really key for working with students in these programs. As oftentimes their programs are intensive, they only have days before a placement is done, before they have to return to coursework and vice versa. And each part of the program, a student needs to pass before they can move on to the next block, which is why a timely response from us and the program and everyone involved in the student support is so important. Advisors in the health program should really have low caseloads, ideally 1 to 85, which is a ratio that we've learned from Lisa Meeks and Dr. Lisa Meeks and the publications that she shared. The dedicated advisors also helps with relationship building. So that way the students know who they can talk to, and if one of us is away out of the office on vacation, that the other person does also equally have the knowledge to support them, as well as so the programs themselves know who to talk to, that even if they reach out to the one of us, we can connect them with the right advisor in terms of specific student case, or if not, we can generally provide an answer to the questions that they might have. It's also important for us and the students in the program to have timely access to the other support staff in our office as well. Sometimes we might need to directly get a hold of our exam team who's implementing the exams upcoming for a student, the program advisor, so that those clear channels of communications is very important. Timely support also means letting the students know that if we don't have an answer, that we will find the answer and get back to them. But making sure that it's just not left hanging because of the nature of the programs, especially some of the programs only being, for example, 2 years long or less. Another key part of our approach is supporting the programs with centralized resources. So while a lot of these programs have resources on their own in terms of their offices and to support students internally. Sometimes smaller programs, especially, will reach out to us to provide these supports, such as having the students write in our accommodated exam center. I would say most students in the health professions do write in our Center for Accessibility Accommodating Exam Center. Some programs will choose to invigilate and accommodate students themselves. But it's helpful to know that our exam team has all the resources and knowledge for implementing exam accommodations. Student tutors and assistants. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a coordinator that works to hire the note takers and hire the tutors. And there's a process for that. And sometimes we'll work with the program directly to hire a support staff, for example, a clinical skills assistant that might have to be a trained profession in that field. Then we'll work with the programs to hire those staff members. It's also important for the programs to know that we can support them in terms of seeking funding for equipment, whether or not that's through the government or through the institutions. Sometimes when we reach out to the programs and say, a student has these accommodations, they'll be concerned, well, where are the resources coming from? And we can help them navigate that process. And it's often a relief to programs when they hear that they don't need to be the ones looking for a note taker, for example, by themselves. Alternate format, this comes up quite often when instructors sometimes don't know how to make materials more accessible. PowerPoint, for example, many programs have great accessibility checkers already built in, but sometimes they need additional supports for more complex alternate format conversions. So we do have a team that works with the students on that. Obviously, we promote and encourage UDL design principles for learning materials, just because while we do have an alternate format team, sometimes it does take time for the material to be produced and get to the student in time for them to keep up with their studies. Over to Jolene.
So in thinking about all of these things, I was going to sort of narrow it down a bit right now to talk about our individual or our specific advisor best practices at UBC, and in particular when we're working with the health professions. So for Joey and myself, our office does work from an intersectional approach. And we do take students' lived experience, or we do consider students to have the expertise in their own lived experience. And I think that's, just, a great way to really begin that conversation so that students feel heard where they're coming to our office. Heard and valued, right? So one of the most important things is when working in the health professions is, I believe, is understanding the history of colonization and the impact on Indigenous peoples in Canada. We know that there's so much information out now about how Indigenous people have been negatively impacted in healthcare and education. And so really decolonizing our practice in order to address those inequitable situations. And particularly there's the impact on accessing education in healthcare, becoming health professionals, and then in supporting, in working as a health professional, how that helps Indigenous patients, Indigenous peoples access healthcare and improve Indigenous patient health outcomes. We look at the TRC and the 94 calls to action when thinking about how we're working with those with students, Indigenous students in the programs, and of course, how we can use that information to help all of our students in the programs. We want to think about providing wraparound services. So that means knowing about all of the support services that are available across the institution if students need to have good referrals to other student services, such as counseling or health services, or other types of student resources that are available, housing, etc. on campus. Also, in order to be a good accessibility advisor, I think there's some key values that we bring to work every day. Things like being self-aware, balance in our lives and our work, being intentional in our practice, being authentic, being happy. I think that's really underrated. I think we all have a right to be happy. We have a right to be happy at work. And our students have a right to be happy when they're studying, when they're pursuing their goals, when they're in their educational programs, and further on through their life. So I always try to emphasize that with students, that you have a right to be happy. And we know that centering the most marginalized people, or the most marginalized students, it does benefit everyone. And there's a lot of research out there about the impact of culturally competent care and services for people and what that means. So when we incorporate all of those values into our daily work practice, what comes about is strong relationships, and that we know that having strong relationships with all of our campus partners is a key. So strong relationships with our students, with our colleagues in our office, with campus partners, with all of the programs and faculties. Joey and myself, we work very hard to have those good, strong relationships, which lead to better outcomes for students. Faculty know who to contact if there's an issue, if there's a concern, and we can work through problems together. And hopefully students feel welcome and included in our programs. We want to have good communication at all, as much as possible. Timeliness in our communication is really key in terms of serving the students, particularly where they're in these cohort programs where timeliness is very important in implementing accommodations and if there's any problems that arise. So having good access to the advisors, again, to the exam team, program advisors, and other advising offices across campus. We want to be proactive as much as possible reaching out to students, reaching out to the programs as much as possible in advance. We're lucky at UBC to have a lot of institutional resources. Joey talked about a lot of those in previous, a couple of slides back, but we are very lucky to work at an institution that has a lot of resources available. And so we're able to implement those support services for students. I have your excellent knowledge of the programs we work with. Well, we hope to have excellent knowledge, but programs change all the time. So as much as possible, we want to keep up to date on all of the programs that we're working with, any changes. UBC changes a lot constantly. We have a lot of distributed programs now. So the health programs, the primary programs are at UBC Vancouver, but we have many distributed sites in the Fraser Valley, Prince George, and Victoria. We need to know about financial resources. So, students who are eligible, student loan eligible, and eligible for permanent disability status with student aid programs, and also what types of bursaries and scholarships are available for students. And as Joey also mentioned, the ability to recognize ableism and challenge it. And we also want to be creative problem solvers. And that means not only for just ourselves, it's a team effort. So really working with students, working with programs, working with clinical preceptors to talk about barriers, how to reduce those barriers, how to improve access, and to come up with creative solutions together. So the common barriers for students navigating clinical accommodations. I would say one of the most common things I hear when a student, registers with a program or is admitted to a program, and then the program receives their accommodation letter, or maybe even receives their accommodations for admissions or for the interview process. We often hear negative things right away. The comments often can be, oh, the student, there's no way they can do this program. There's no way they're going to be able to graduate. There's no way they're going to be work in this profession. So really advocating for students and challenging those assumptions right away is an important part of our role. Some of the more common things are just faculty or programs are unfamiliar with the accommodation process. They might be new in their role. They just didn't even know that accommodations existed themselves. And so their initial reaction is like, it's not possible. So we do have to work a lot to reduce stigma and to educate staff and faculty in different programs about what is possible, what is our legal right, our legal duty to accommodate, and also about how students with disabilities are, significant and powerful members of our community. And, we really do work from a strengths perspective that these students are bringing, a wealth of information and a wealth of experience that is only going to enhance and improve everyone's experience when they're a part of different programs. Some of the questions we get is, what happens if the student fails their placement? And it's like, well, that's fine if a student fails a placement. Like, students fail placements all the time. And it's not a higher percentage of students with disabilities as students without disabilities. Things come up and people fail placements, and students have to redo their placements. That's just a normal part of the education process. And then, another thing that we often hear is, how will this be fair for the other students? And I always just say, we're not trying to we're not here to talk about students without disabilities and making things fair for them. We're here to talk about reducing barriers for this one particular student. So we do hear that a lot. And I think it's just, that ableist attitude, and it's about stigma around accommodating students with disabilities or being welcoming and inclusive for students with disabilities. So we do have to address those issues as well. And then again, the lack of flexibility in many of the health professions, because they are these timely, very strict, guided programs that are full-time, full-on coursework, full-on clinical placements. And so really addressing the need to change those, because we can see in how the medical systems are having problems now in retaining staff, and that people are burnt out, right? People who are working full-time positions with a lot of overtime as well, end up being burnt out and being unable to continue in their profession. So we know that reducing those types of issues can only improve the outcomes in the system as a whole. Again, timelines for implementing accommodations. These are some of the common issues that we hear, is that, they've received the accommodations too late. It's midway through the student's placement. It's impossible to implement. But, we have to try in good faith. Like, that's what we say. We have to make a good faith effort to implement accommodations in a timely manner. Sometimes it's not possible, I'll admit that, but we do have to make a good faith effort. And that's what I say to programs and to clinical educators as well. It's fine if we can't do, if it really is impossible, we understand, but we have to make a good faith effort to put accommodations in place when they arise, because students' disabilities aren't, or the impact of a student's disabilities are not, what's the word I'm thinking of? They're not stagnant, or they're not, finite. So they can change at any time. People's life circumstances change at any time. People can be diagnosed with a permanent disability or an ongoing medical condition at any point in their degree progression. So we do have to assess students when these things come up and implement accommodations when needed. And we can't just say, oh, we can only assess students at one point in time. It's just not realistic. And then again, concerns about resources, that we don't have enough staff to support this, or location accommodations for clinical placements aren't possible. Just common things, the barriers and the stigma that we hear and that we have to address on a regular basis when within our office.
So we're going to be talking more now about the areas to be accommodated. And honestly, we could do a whole presentation just on this. So in the interest of time and leaving room to answer questions, we'll just kind of go over this at a higher level. We'll mostly be focusing on the first part, pre-admission accommodations and clinical accommodations, as I think folks in the audience are likely more familiar with didactic accommodations, which would be things that are in the exam setting, classroom settings, so such as extended time on exams or access to lecture materials. So starting off with pre-admission accommodations. Admissions accommodations, I would say one of the key things of this is making sure this is communicated during the recruitment stages of inviting students to apply for your program. They need to know that this is possible, this is available to them, and hopefully that it's not a thing that they just ask and send an email to a person and they get redirected to another person, that there is a well thought out process for applying for pre-admission accommodations. It's also helpful to have a timeline that takes into account students with disabilities, and coordinating these timelines with your accessibility office so that there is time for students to reach out, for the accessibility office to meet with the students, and then the accessibility advisors to be able to follow up with the program about these accommodations. Sometimes because of these, lack of a clear process or a lack of timelines, we've heard programs that run into barriers about thinking that they're not able to provide interview accommodations or admission accommodations. It's important to build that time and to build those resources. There are resources in place for interviews. So some of those resources, if there's a student with disabilities with accommodations, need to be allocated to support those students. And it can't be that, just because we run out of time or resources, then the student will just simply not be accommodated. Here are some examples of possible accommodations. Most commonly, we see requests for GPA consideration or prerequisite course-specific consideration for health professions. And that typically would require some medical documentation as well as a rationale and some transcripts from those students for us to be able to review these requests. For interview accommodations, MMI type interviews are very common these days, usually on some sort of platform online. So that accommodations might look like reviewing the prompts ahead of time, extended time to respond. Sometimes the students will require captioning or ASL interpreters, ability to write notes, and also building into time the process that if it is on an online platform, or when you buy into an online platform for MMIs, just knowing what accessibility features exist and what might be possible, and that might involve going back to the source and asking those questions. This is an overview of the process that we would take to review and assess accommodations in the clinical context. So as we chatted about earlier, this is a very interactive process between the advisor and the student, as well as with the program. It requires clear communication with everyone involved, as well as a continued review of accommodations as necessary. Just keeping in mind, as we talk about accommodations in terms of supporting students with the health professions, accommodations is one piece, but it's also important for advisors to be aware of resources, communities, mentorship opportunities that students with disabilities in the health professions can be a part of. Oftentimes I'll hear students that, they've heard from a student or heard from this thing that was posted on a Facebook group about something to ask me about during our initial conversation. So it's important to know, what are those Facebook groups out there? Have they heard about the Adults with Disabilities Initiative? Are they, are undergraduate medical education students aware that they can access the BC Physicians Health Network? All these pieces are a part of the wraparound support that we can provide to these students. And before we go into a case example, there are situations where a clinical accommodation request might be beyond reasonable. But before just saying no or whatever decision is shared, it's important that there is a process, like outlined in the slide before, of making sure you're talking to the student, the program, there's conversations involved, and that the determination of whether or not it is reasonable is determined by all those duty to accommodate factors that we've discussed before, and Springer also talked about before. So administrative burden, institutional burden, whether or not it'll interfere with essential learning outcomes. It's also important to know when it's time to bring in your supervisors, so associate directors, the directors, the legal team, and also important that throughout the process that there's ongoing communication with the students so they know what's happening and that their request is being looked into as well.
Yeah, so I put together a case example here, and it's not based on one individual because we didn't want to run the risk of identifying any individual student or any individual program. So this is just sort of a consolidated case example of what sometimes happens with a student situation. Sometimes what happens with students is that instead of coming and speaking to us directly, they don't feel comfortable doing that. So they might go to the Ombuds office or the Equity office at UBC to seek an advocate, and perhaps telling those advisors in those offices that, CFA our office is refusing to accommodate the student, and the student is, unhappy with our office. So then sometimes that ends up being that that office will then, email my supervisor to ask for a meeting. And right away, right, like as an advisor, that, raises your heart rate and your concern over how you've, worked with this student or what you might have done incorrectly or how the student might be feeling in this situation. But in this one example, this student, did go to another office, had an advocate at the university emailing our office on behalf of the student and asking for a meeting. The student brought, a whole long list of requests for accommodations for their program. And then, they were told to come and meet with me directly, which they did. But I always keep in mind, students have the right to appeal any decisions that an advisor makes. They have a right to appeal any decision our office makes, and they have a right to go and talk to any office across the university that they want to. And that is totally fine. And that's the student's right. And so really trying not to take it personally when students feel like they need to seek other support and other advocates across the university, because that's absolutely their right. So again, making sure that we're going through that interactive process, that we're listening to the student, listening to what they feel they need as accommodations, and then letting the student know what's going to happen next. So either I can approve those accommodations right away, or I need to consult with my colleagues, or I need to consult with my supervisor, and even perhaps sometimes consulting with the program about what accommodations may be possible or what might not be possible. So we went through that process with this student in particular. Also, the student asked that they be CC'd on every email that I send and that they attend any meeting that I have with the program. So I think, in previous sessions today, we talked about that, or that was talked about as well, that students want to have control over the situation, and I totally understand that. But in these situations, the advisor, we are the drivers of the process. So it's important to let the student know that, I understand that that is what you would like to see happen, but it's not going to happen. Like, I'm not going to be CCing you on every email I send, and I'm not going to be inviting you to every meeting that I have with the program. I will be communicating with you clearly and promptly, though, any further information I have and about what the process looks like. So that's always what I communicate with the student that I am being authentic. I'm going to be open and honest with you as much as possible. But there are processes at the university that, I need to lead, and I need to make the first and second and third steps about. So in this particular situation, I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to just quickly sum it up that we went through the process, the interactive process. I met with my supervisor, we went to the program, we consulted with UBC Legal, and then we went back to the student. Actually, we didn't go back to the student. We went to the program, we went to UBC Legal, and then simultaneously, I kept the doors of communication open with the student about the other accommodations they were currently receiving to make sure that things were still progressing in a timely manner, that the student didn't need any additional support with the accommodations that we'd already approved. So really being proactive in terms of maintaining a good relationship with the student while these dual processes are taking place. And then what happened is that program actually offered the student a clinical placement according to their timelines and their guidelines. And the student was actually happy with the placement they were offered and accepted it. And so we didn't even need to go back to this list of accommodations the student had requested, which really, they were an administrative burden, and we would not have approved, I don't think, any of the accommodations that the student had requested. So, it just shows like this long, and it was a months long process, 4, 5, 6 months this took, but showing how just maintaining those good lines of communication and not taking these situations personally, but really accepting where the student's at and also what the program's capable of doing to implement particular accommodations or their inability to implement particular accommodations. Just quickly now to talk about some types of the clinical accommodations that we do put in place. There's ones around scheduling, so the proximity to your clinical placement or an accessible location. As I mentioned, we have lots of rural sites now, distributed sites across the province, so students still can have location accommodations when they're studying at one of our distributed sites. There might be some scheduling changes around the order of placements or accommodations around the order of placements for students. Scheduling and limited hours, so hard stops maybe at 10 p.m. or no overnights for certain programs. There are some programs where you can have an accommodation of no overnights, for example, nursing. But there's also programs such as midwifery where that's not possible in order to meet the essential learning outcomes of the program. So again, really either understanding what's available in the programs or what's possible in terms of accommodations, or knowing when we have to tell the student, I'm not sure, I have to check. Right? So I'm not sure, I understand what you're asking for, I understand what your needs are, but I still have to go back to the program and follow up with them and determine if this is a reasonable accommodation and whether you're still going to be able to meet those essential learning outcomes of the program. And again, we provide accommodations such as, leaves of absence, supporting leaves of absences, or whether a student may need a short-term absence or even a one-day absence from their program. And then we also work with students when they need a decelerated program and taking part-time versus full-time, which is possible, even though many of the programs tell us it's not possible. And then here's some more examples of the clinical accommodations, the access barriers, and the types of disabilities where the functional impact might impact a student's ability to participate in a program and what those accommodations might be. So again, proximities or accessible locations, feedback in writing, additional times for charting. These are all common accommodations that we put in place across all of the health programs. And back over to Joey.
Thank you. So more clinical accommodations could be around materials such as assistive technology, specialized equipment, or ergonomics or furniture related, or communication related accommodations such as different communication devices, access to patient information in advance, scheduled feedback, appropriate feedback provided in writing, as Jolie just mentioned, or captioning, or ASL, or having an ASL interpreter in these spaces. One thing to consider for I think a couple of different of these accommodations is what that looks like in health authority contexts. So with assistive technology, I've been working with on a student case where there was assistive technology that isn't on any type of health authority laptop or system, and we are still in the process. I would say after over 6 months or so of kind of getting through the clearance with IT, risk assessments, internet security, and all those pieces. So my lesson learned from that I'm happy to share is that these things take time. There's so many layers of licenses and things to get through. And then in the meantime, because the students started their placement, it's about what supports can we put in place. So in our case was we hired some access assistants to help them with the charting while they're on their placements. But on that note, similar to an interpreter, different access assistants, we then had to think of how to get them clearance onto the site. So that required them doing almost the same online modules, online clearance modules, completing criminal record checks and all those pieces, and making sure that we were clear from the health authorities what was needed to clear them to get into those spaces as well. So things to look at around that, assistive technology, some are specific to the medical field, so like Dragon Medical for dictation. Some may already exist. Whether or not a student can use their own computer due to security reasons are all things to consider. I've shown up here a couple of images of different assistive technology in the medical setting. So one image has a learner who is using a wheelchair with a lift. We have been successful in the past in working with the government for finding support for a medical education student who required a wheelchair with a lift and obtaining some funding for that. There's a digital autoscope beside it, so that enhances the image being seen. Below that, there is a virtual reality device that shows a skeleton and the vascular system inside of that skeleton. We have used a VR headset before in one of our settings. As a byproduct of COVID, there was a virtual anatomy lab that was already in existence for one of the courses, and then we were able to kind of use that to support a student with accommodations. There's an amplified stethoscope, which paired with the digital device, it's important to consider whether or not in a testing setting, a student would be able to bring in a digital device or not. In one of the cases I worked with in the context of a formative OSCE, it was determined that the student didn't need the actual readings, they just needed to demonstrate how they would use a stethoscope. So that's important conversations to have with the students in the program. And then lastly, there is a sim lab of a person who is pregnant with a fetus inside. So all some examples. And as we are running very low on time now, I've already described some of these different clinical accommodations and approaches. Additional time is one that sometimes is challenging for everyone to be able to land on the same page, because questions will be asked about, what certain procedures need to be completed within a certain time frame versus other procedures not. That will require some very interactive conversations with the program to determine what is critical competency that needs to be met that has a time-based component to it and what it doesn't. And other things such as different alternate clothing, different gowning for wheelchair users, disability and diversity. The book has a great section on that for wheelchair users that might need to go into a sterile surgical field. And also recognizing, foods and liquids, sometimes that might not be possible in certain clinical settings. So that an accommodation for that might look more like access to food and drinks and more frequent breaks for that.
So I did have another case example, but I'll just skip that because we're at the end of our time. My apologies. I think it just shows that Joey and I are very passionate about this topic, and there's a lot of information to share. Here's our list of resources, key resources that we often refer to, and that's included in your PowerPoint slides. So I hope that everyone has the chance to look at these resources if they haven't already. And I just wanted to say thanks for having us, and I'm sorry that we won't have chance for Q&A.
Morgan has offered for them to put the questions in the Q&A in an email so that we can answer them, and we have said yes. Or I have said yes for us, Jolie. So that's what we'll be doing. Thank you for coming to our presentation. And yes, if you have more questions, seeing as we're going to be answering them on email anyways, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we will get to them over writing. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Joey and Jolie. Really great to know that you'll be able to respond to some questions online. There were a couple in the chat here. So thank you so much for offering that. And it's just always really interesting and valuable to hear how other universities approach this work. And we just want to thank you for sharing your best practices with us. It's a very big conversation and topic, so you've covered a lot of ground in an hour, and I'm sure that we could spend another lots of time talking about it, so thank you so much. And to wrap up today, I mean, we're at 4:01, so I'm just going to wrap up and speak to you a little bit about tomorrow's program. Tomorrow's program will begin at 9 a.m. We'll have a keynote speaker, Dr. Diana Sejas, in the morning, followed by a break. Then Dr. Naomi Lear and Ben Poynton will be talking about navigating procedures and service emotional support animals in clinical environments. We'll take lunch, and then we'll finish the day with UofT's rehab sector discussing navigating clinical accommodations from documentation to implementation. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll see you all again online tomorrow at 9 a.m. and wishing you all a wonderful evening. Take care.